All right, guys, we are going to jump into LT3 notes. And so you need the notes packet that I handed you in class. And we're going to talk about the first 2 or 3 sections of this notes packet. So you've done a little bit of pre-work. You did an intro assignment on Google Classroom when you were in class this week, and it introduced you to the concept of motor units. So motor units are the combination of one motor neuron and then any muscle cell that neuron extends out and connects to. And so here, if we track one motor neuron, we could track the purple one here. A motor unit would be this purple motor neuron extended out, landing on two muscle cells. This red motor neuron extends out and lands on 3 muscle cells. So the size of the motor units can vary depending on how many actual muscle cells the nerve makes contact with. And so one motor neuron, and then any individual muscle fiber or muscle cell that neuron connects to equals a motor unit. So like I said just a second ago, motor units can be small. Small units are small in the sense that the motor neuron lands on a few cells, but not that many. Right? So small units have fewer cells. Small units are really good at establishing precision and fine motor control. So, like the muscles in your fingers, those are small motor units that allows for your hands to have great dexterity, great precision, and great control. The muscle units that are surrounding your eyes that actually control the ability for you to move, like your eyeball, not blinking, but movement of the actual eye. Those are really small motor units that allows for you to have really good precision as you control your eye. Larger units have more cells in them. So one motor neuron connects to many muscle cells. And because of that, we sacrifice a little bit of the precision, but what we gain is strength. And so we see that large motor units are very strong and very powerful. A great example would be those large muscles that we learned about when we talked about the quadriceps or the hamstrings, your biceps, your triceps. Those large muscles, those are large motor units. Now, it's important that we make sure that we understand when ACH, which is the neurotransmitter that the nerve is going to release, when ACH is released from the neuron, all of the cells that neuron is connected to will contract together at the same time. And that is called a twitch. And so a muscle twitch is a vocab component that we need to carry forward into the next section of our notes. So essentially, I'm summing up here, motor units are one nerve and then any muscle cells that nerve is going to synapse with or connect with and release ACH onto. When the neuron releases the ACH, all of the muscle cells within that unit contract together. And there can be large units and small units, each of which have their own particular function. So let's focus on the twitch, okay? So you have this diagram. I'll come back to this box in a second. Don't write anything here yet. So you have this diagram, except yours is not labeled. And so this is one twitch. And a twitch is broken down into 3 different phases or periods. And that's what you need to label. So here are the phases or periods. There is a latent period. It's very short. It's very small in terms of time. There's a contraction period for the motor unit, and then there's a relaxation period for the motor unit. So take a second, pause the video, label your diagram with those 3 components, and then come back and let's talk about it. So this particular diagram making sure we understand our axis, this is the amount of tension on a muscle cell, or on a motor unit rather, as time progresses. And so initially that tension is very low. It's going to peak rather quickly, and then it's going to slowly relax tension as we move through these 3 stages or phases of a muscle twitch. So let's talk about what's actually happening. This is a great opportunity to connect what we learned in LT2, the way that actual muscles contract, to the stages or phases of a muscle twitch. So initially in this latent period, this very short window of time, what we see happening in the muscle cell is what happens from the time ACH is released from the neuron all the way through calcium binding, right? So remember last unit, we talked about a muscle cell releases ACH that binds to a neuron releases ACH that binds to the surface of the muscle cell. It stimulates that muscle cell membrane, and that stimulation or action potential travels down the T tubules and causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. Calcium floats down and it binds to the troponin complex on the actin myofilament. And so what's happening in the latent period is kind of what I just described. ACH released, everything I talked about, calcium pushed out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and binds to troponin. But we don't see the actual connection of myosin and actin together and them pushing on each other, which was called the cross-bridge cycle. That's not happening yet. So tension is very low because we actually haven't started the contraction process. We basically just set everything up to allow for what's coming next. And so the next phase is called the contraction phase or the contraction period. And this is when we see actin and myosin actually engaging in that cross-bridge cycle. Remember when myosin jumped up, grabbed a hold of actin on the open binding spot, and then pushed and released, right? ATP binds, it releases, and ATP converts, re-energizes that myosin head, it jumps up again, it pushes, and we get this thing called a contraction. So a contraction continues for the next couple of seconds. On this diagram, about 5 to 25 seconds is the contraction period. And then we enter this phase of relaxation. And so relaxation is the reset. So this is essentially disengaging your actin and your myosin, restoring your calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and reabsorbing, reuptaking, or possibly breaking down ACH, getting it out of the neuromuscular junction. So stopping, kind of backwards thinking, that whole process we talked about in LT2, that's what's happening in relaxation. And so tension slowly declines as we reset the system. Now, let's talk about this red box. One twitch, one of these right here, is actually not enough to make the entire muscle group contract. And so what we need are several twitches that sort of build one upon the next, upon the next, upon the next, to sustain what we would consider an actual muscle contraction. And so with that, we're going to watch a short section of this video before we continue the next portion of our notes. So check this out.
They contract to create both quick and sustained movements and to regulate force. How can Claire's hands gently pet this corgi in one moment and then crush a can in another? I got 2 words for you. Motor units. A motor unit is a group of muscle fibers that all get their signals from the same single motor neuron. Since all those fibers listen to only one neuron, they act together as a unit. In a big power-generating muscle like your rectus femoris and your quad, each of 1,000 or so motor neurons may synapse with and innervate 1,000 muscle fibers. Those 1,000 fibers together form a large motor unit, and big units are typically found in muscles that perform big, not very delicate movements, like walking and squatting and drop kicking. But other muscles muscles, like the ones that control your eyes and fingers, which exert fine motor control, may have just a handful of muscle fibers connected to a single motor neuron. Those relationships are small motor units. And when a motor unit, no matter how large or small, responds to a single action potential, those fibers quickly contract and release in what we call a twitch. And every tiny twitch has 3 distinct phases. To understand which happens when, we got to go back to the sliding filament model. Immediately after a muscle fiber is stimulated by a nerve, when calcium ions are flooding into the sarcomeres to pull away those 2 protein bodyguards of tropomyosin and troponin from the actin, that's called the latent period. The stimulus has arrived, but no force is being produced. That's when the action is just starting. Then comes a brief period of contraction when the myosin heads are binding and pulling and releasing over and over, and the muscle fibers contract. But soon the fiber slides back down into the relaxation period when the calcium gets pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the actin and myosin stop the binding cycle, and the muscle relaxes. Each phase consists of a lot of little steps, and while you couldn't tell by watching my brother dance, the fact is that our muscular movements are pretty smooth. That's because one muscle can produce a variation of smooth forces called graded muscle responses. And their general functions as individual organs, how do they...
So I'm pausing for a second. What we've seen thus far is a recap of what we've talked about. Here comes the idea that we're going to talk about next, which is that we need to build twitch upon twitch upon twitch upon twitch to get an actual muscle contraction. So check this part out. Pay attention to this part.
Contract to create both quick and sustained movements and to regulate force. How can Claire's hands gently pet this corgi in what distinct phases? To understand which happens, that's when the action is just starting. Then comes a brief period of contraction when the myosin heads are binding and pulling and releasing over and over, and the muscle fibers contract. But soon the fiber slides back down into the relaxation period when the calcium gets pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the actin and myosin stop the binding cycle, and the muscle relaxes. Each phase consists of a lot of little steps, and while you couldn't tell by watching my brother dance, the fact is that our muscular movements are pretty smooth. That's because one muscle can produce a variation of smooth forces called graded muscle responses, and they're generally affected by both the frequency and strength with which they're stimulated. So say Claire's trying to lift something heavy, like a paint can. Just as the volume of a sound corresponds to the frequency of action potentials from your ear to your brain, her brain gets her muscles to increase their force by increasing the frequency with which her motor neurons are firing. It's like pushing a button over and over again really fast. Lift! You can do it. Feel the burn, or whatever. And the faster these nerve impulses fire, the stronger each successive twitch gets, since the muscle doesn't get a chance to relax in between. Because remember, the relaxation period of a twitch is when the calcium is being pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If another action potential travels down before that can happen, even more calcium gets released, which ends up exposing more actin for myosin to bind to, and that means more force in that fiber. In this way, twitches end up adding to each other as they get closer together in time, and that's what we call temporal summation. At some point, though, almost all of the actin binding sites are exposed, so all of the myosin heads can work through their cycles of ATP and ADP, and the muscle force can't increase anymore, even with faster action potentials and more calcium. When all those little twitches blend together until they feel like one gigantic contraction, that's called tetanus. At that point, any person on the planet will hit a ceiling of maximum tension. That tension means myosin and the calcium pumps are burning up the muscle cell's ATP, and the finite supply of ATP is what makes it impossible to maintain vigorous muscle activity indefinitely. Prolonged contraction leads to muscle fatigue, and when your muscles just can't take it anymore, all that tension crashes to zero. And remember, all of this twitching happens in individual motor units. Since twitches are driven by action potentials, and action potentials only have one intensity, frequency is the only way to create a grade of force. So when we zoom out to the complete muscle of maybe 1,000 motor units, we can increase the strength of the stimulus by sending action potentials to more motor units. If amping up frequency is like hitting a button again and again, then increasing the signal strength is like smashing the whole keyboard with your forehead. Since multiple action potentials don't travel down all the motor neurons at exactly the same time, each motor unit twitches at slightly different times, which helps smooth out the twitchiness. So contractions intensify as your motor neurons stimulate more and more muscle fibers. This is a process called recruitment, or multiple motor unit summation, and it's where some of your muscles' more nuanced abilities come in. So let's say Claire is holding Abby. She wants to hold on to her tight so that Abby doesn't fall, but not too tight, right? So to increase the contraction force and tighten her grip, she can recruit another motor unit. Recruiting one with 20 fibers will firm her grasp, but calling on one with 1,000 fibers might Well, let's not think about that too much. Lucky for our corgi friend, this recruitment doesn't escalate at random. It follows what's known as a size principle. It starts when the smallest motor units with the smallest fibers are activated by your most excitable neurons. Then some larger motor units with larger fibers are enlisted, increasing the strength of contraction. And finally, if you want to give it all you got, which you don't in Abby's case, your largest motor units with your biggest muscle fibers will get involved. These big guns are the last to join up, in part because they're controlled by your largest and least excitable motor neurons. But when they're in, they are all in, packing 50 times the force of those smaller fibers. So the basic rule is the more motor units recruited, the greater the force that's generated. Now that we know how muscle contractions happen, let's look at our two main flavors, isotonic and isometric. Say I want to pick up my crash course.
All right, so that extends a little beyond what we are ready for. So let's take what he talked about, which he talked about very fast, and let's break it down a little bit. Okay, so you have this diagram next in your notes, and this diagram is another thing that we're going to label. But this diagram is a diagram of what's called a myogram, and that myo as a prefix tells us that this deals with muscles. And so this basically would be a readout from an apparatus that is testing the tension that exists in your muscles as you are attempting a contraction. And so we see tension, and we also see force over here of the contraction, which kind of go hand in hand. And so what I will show you first is that what we've just discussed with the latent and the contraction and the relaxation, collectively called a twitch, here is one of those twitches. So take a moment on your diagram and label this first sort of bump as one twitch. And so all the things that are happening within a twitch are happening right there. And we talked about one twitch really isn't enough to make the full muscle contract. And so let's progress into this next section of the graph. Here you see a twitch that doesn't fully relax before a second twitch happens on its heels. And so the next section of the diagram, we see two twitches back to back. And then as you move forward, you see four twitches back to back. And so what we're seeing here is what he talked about in the video. You're seeing twitch upon twitch upon twitch upon twitch, but it's really important that they happen before full relaxation of the previous twitch occurs. And so we're trying to essentially build up a powerful contraction, right? Increasing the force of a contraction. And this is collectively can be called wave summation, where one twitch is building upon the next, upon the next, upon the next, building a forceful contraction. And that ultimately leads to an actual contraction, which is called tetanus. And so indicate on your diagram, this last region is called tetanus. One thing that he didn't address on this diagram or this concept is the idea that you can't sustain tetanus. Well, I mean, he did talk about you can't sustain tetanus forever because you're going to run out of ATP. And so as tetanus declines, this is where we would see muscle fatigue. So if you've ever done an exercise that they ask you to do as many reps to exhaustion, that's really what you're seeing here, is that you have worked and worked and worked your muscles. You have forcefully contracted them until you cannot anymore. And fatigue sets in, and down comes the tension on the muscle and the force of the contraction as a result. So make sure that these components are labeled on your diagram before we take a few notes under the diagram. So here it is again, and this is a component that I actually blocked out. So we have action potential. So this is like the nerve stimulating. But what we wanted to focus on was the tension on the muscle and the force of the contraction. So here's what I want to talk about. There are a couple of vocab words. Something that he tossed out is called a graded muscle response. Now that is basically the summation. That's a term that could refer to this entire diagram from start to finish, where we have built twitch upon twitch to make the entire muscle contract. Now what we labeled in the diagram as tetanus, full muscle contraction, could also be recognized as this term right here, a sustained contraction. So either of those could apply to that last little bit of a diagram. So this diagram essentially shows a graded muscle response. He also talked about the idea that if a motor unit is having a hard time producing a graded muscle response, so this is one motor unit trying to work towards tetanus, if it can't achieve tetanus or sustained contraction, it can call in help from neighboring units. And that is called recruitment or multiple motor unit summation. Either of those words could be recognized as similar in concept. So the idea here is the diagram we have just labeled is one motor unit attempting to fully contract the cells that the neuron lands on. If it can't reach tetanus, if it can't reach a sustained contraction, then it will ask for neighbor motor unit support or help. And so that last little bit of vocab, recruitment, multiple motor unit summation, is something to be aware of as well. Now, where we are headed next is the idea of different kinds of contractions based on not just the force of the contraction, but kind of the length of the muscle as the contraction is occurring. And that depends completely on how heavy is the load that you are trying to exert some force on. So we get a little bit physicsy, not too much, but a little bit physicsy in the next section of notes. But we're going to be done for today. So when you're finished with this, you are done.